Version 2 and then the compatibility mode of V1 and V2 have exactly the same sequence of presentation as does SSH version 1. It just doesn't support the login banner. So you may have to go through and change the banners that you're presenting, and you have to be aware of the order that they're being presented based on whether you're running Telnet or SSH. And the easiest way to show this, I'll jump over here and show it to you on the command line right now. The big takeaway from this is that when you're moving from Telnet to SSH, you may have to change which banner you use. If you're using the message of the day banner, that'll still work with SSH, but it's going to be displayed after a user logs in, and that might not meet the legal requirements that you need. So you'll want to switch to the login banner because that's going to be displayed before a user logs in, and then you're probably not going to want to support SSH version 1 because it's not displayed at all. So if you have the requirement that you have to show a banner prior to somebody logging in, your choices are to stay on Telnet, which is insecure, or to move to SSH version 2 or compatibility mode and utilize the login banner, because the rest of these banners in SSH are only shown after login. And right now I'll show you how that works on the command line. What I've done is on R1 I do have SSH set up. I'm also allowing Telnet at this point. So on R1 I've configured 3 banners: the message of the day banner, the exec banner, and the login banner, and I just have them use their name. What I'm doing here is just when I log in, it will pop up, each banner that's presented will pop up, and we'll be able to identify which banner it is by the verbiage of the banner. Okay, and so then I went to R2 and I telnetted. So with Telnet, presentation goes, the message of the day banner gets presented first, then the login banner, and then once you're logged in, the exec banner. These show up in odd places, but so it goes message of the day, login, and exec. And so now I did an SSH session using compatibility mode, and you can see here the first one that you're presented with is the login banner. So it's a little different order here with the message of the day. It's not presented first as it was with Telnet. Once you log in, you get the message of the day banner and then the exec banner. You can see the sequence of banner presentations a little bit different between Telnet and SSH. And here I've done the same thing. I've created an SSH session from R2 to R1, and you can see here the difference is the login banner doesn't appear at all, and that's a gotcha that you want to know about. It's only with version 1. I'll show you that in a second when I specify version 2. There's a difference because with Telnet you got the message of the day and then the login before you even log in, and then you give your credentials, and then you get the exec banner once you get an exec prompt. With compatibility mode, it shows in a little different order. You get the login banner first, then the message of the day, and the exec banner after you've logged in. Version 1, same type of thing, except they just don't give you a login banner at all. You get the MOTD and the exec banner once you log in. Okay, and then for completeness sakes, I just went ahead and specified version 2, and you get the login banner. Same thing as when you're running in compatibility mode, which makes sense because you're actually using version 2. The takeaway from this is that if you have banners that present stuff that is from your legal department that says I have to have this on all my devices, you may want to know that when you do change from Telnet to SSH, that the order of the presentation of these banners is going to be different. So if you're presenting your message of the day banner, it's not going to be shown until after a user has logged in. And if you're using a login banner as your to present your your details, whatever, you want to know that if somebody's using version 1, they're not going to see that at all. So that's the basics of SSH, and we're able to configure this and SSH from one device to another. There are some additional options. Luckily, they're all global configuration commands, and they all start with IP SSH. So just remember to put the IP and then space SSH, hit your question mark, and it will tell you all the different configuration options you have for SSH. The ones that are bolded here, they don't really stand out too much. Other ones we're going to take a look at. These are kind of the common ones that you might use. The first of these options is the SSH authentication retries, and that's going to set the number of SSH login attempts before terminating the login process. So this is if you were connecting from R1 to R2. By default, you're going to get 3 shots at getting that password correct before it stops the SSH login process. We see this with Telnet as well. This shouldn't be a surprise, but you can change this to anything you want from 1 to, I don't know what the upper limit is, but default is 3. The timeout is the number of seconds until the SSH login will time out on its own. So if you attempt to SSH from R1 to R2 and you don't type type in anything, after 120 seconds, it's going to stop that login process. One thing to keep in mind is this is for the login process. This is not your executive timeout. That's going to be the amount of time that will expire when you don't do anything, and I have a lesson on that as well. That's going to be the default of 10 minutes. And as we see here, if you do a show IP SSH, that's going to show you the version, the authentication timeout, and the authentication retries. Here we have the defaults of 120 seconds and 3 retries. And the other two SSH configuration options that you might want to use. Source interface, that's going to set the SSH client to use a specific IP address as a source interface. So if you're going to SSH from R1 to R2, by default it's going to use the IP address of the outgoing interface as its source IP address. When it connects to R2, you can change that to a different interface. A lot of times you might want to do that, set that to a loopback. The version, this is a big one. If you want to specify which SSH version to use, by default you're going to use compatibility mode, which is version 1 and version 2, which is referred to as SSH-1.99 in Ciscoese. And you can see here again with the show IP SSH command that you can verify at least the version. You can't verify the source interface. And here I've set it to version 2 instead of using the compatibility version. I've also changed the authentication timeout from the default of 120 seconds to 30 seconds and changed the authentication retries from the default of 3 to 2. While this is an optional step, I think it should be mandatory in most implementations, and that is disabling Telnet access on the VTY lines. So when you go and you configure your device for SSH and you set up all the steps that we showed earlier, in this case R1 has been set up for SSH. What you might think then is like, okay, you can only use SSH to access this device. And that's not true. It will allow you to still telnet to it. So after all of that configuration and setting up your Cisco security policy with your usernames and your privilege levels, and then you've thrown SSH on there and you're like, man, I'm good, our network is secure. Well, unless you go ahead and explicitly disable telnet access, people can still telnet. And what they'll do is they'll telnet from R2 to R1. They'll log in with the username packetlab and the password packetlab. That's going out on the wire in clear text, and there goes your security. So in most cases, you're going to want to disable Telnet. If you're using SSH, you're going to want to disable Telnet. Only time I can think that you wouldn't want to do this is if you have some users that don't have a client that supports SSH and you still want to allow them access. At that point, I mean, modern world, have them use something that supports SSH. That would be a corner case. I don't see that happening often, so I would make this quote-unquote optional step mandatory in my SSH implementations. And the way that you do that is you're going to go under the VTY lines and you're going to specify the input transport protocols that you will allow and just set that to SSH. By default, it's going to allow everything. When you specify this command, you're saying only allow SSH in. So now when I try to telnet from R2, that connection is going to be refused by the remote host. One thing to note, and I've seen this listed on the interwebs, is this does not prevent the HTTP connection. So you have enabled HTTP on your router, access via HTTP. Just specifying SSH as the only input on the VTY doesn't affect that because it's not really going through the VTY. I'll just keep that in mind. Okay, let's wrap this guy up. SSH is basically Telnet with the addition of encryption. It's going to offer you more security than Telnet, which sends everything in clear text. Because of that, Cisco recommends that you do use SSH instead of Telnet. It's pretty straightforward. There's that one weird little command where you're creating the RSA keys that might throw you off. It's not that difficult. The other bits are that you're going to not be able to use the VTY line password. So if that's what you're using for your Telnet authentication, you're going to have to either create a local username database or hopefully you're using AAA in your network, and that'll take care of that. As long as you have a username password combination, you'll be cool. The other little quote-unquote gotcha is that optional step that we just went over where you're disabling all other protocols inbound on the VTY lines except SSH. I would make that mandatory. That's up to you. I would get rid of Telnet. I wouldn't allow Telnet access to my devices after configuring SSH because you're going to lose the benefit of SSH, which is the encryption. Anyways, the big takeaway from this is SSH is more secure than Telnet. There's really no good reason anymore not to use SSH in place of Telnet. Alright, that's going to wrap it up for this lesson. I hope to see you over on the CLI when we go over the lab portion of configuring SSH on Cisco devices.